Hello all. Today we're going to cover the allegory of the cave. So this is the beginning of week 5. We're doing metaphysics, and the allegory of the cave is interesting not only because it deals with metaphysics, but also because it's kind of epistemological as well, and it has a bit of ethics in there about what we should do in these sorts of situations. So background, um, rather than cover in detail the entirety of the allegory, I'm going to try to motivate some of the ideas underpinning it, talk about some interesting implications, or elaborate on specific points, and give you background knowledge that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get just by reading the text. So, the first thing to note in that regard is that the allegory of the cave appears in Plato's magnum opus, The Republic. So the Republic is 10 books. Each book is a chapter, really. Each is like 20 some pages, maybe. Um, and this was his biggest work. The Republic, on the whole, was on justice, but as Plato liked to do, he meanders through a whole range of subjects. So there's wealth in all sorts of different corners of the Republic on a whole wide range of subjects. And so at some point he gets on this kind of tangent that tries to make an account for um, why we should do philosophy in general. And this is part of it. And I'll also, at the end, I'll talk a little bit about what the normative implications are for us. So on the whole, the Republic is on justice, and that's the big picture. And the allegory of the cave is more telling us the way the world actually is and what we think we know. So another piece of background is, and this is kind of my interpretation, but in a lot of ways, Plato is very interested in defending philosophy as a rigorous field. Um, there's challenges coming from the successes of mathematics and elsewhere, but particularly mathematics and astronomy were doing quite well at the time. A lot of breakthroughs. Dudes like Pythagoras were within Plato's lifetime. Um, so Plato wanted to provide a kind of account of why this stuff matters or why it has the status it does, uh, that kind of saved face in as a result of recent events. And one of the most important recent events in for Plato, I mean contemporaneous events during his lifetime, was the death of Socrates. Um, so I may have mentioned this, and you may be familiar because this is probably one of the most famous tales of our sort of Western history. So Socrates was a Western philosopher, never wrote anything down, ancient Greek guy. He went around the city pestering people, asking other Athenians various questions about what they thought they knew, and for various reasons that he was accused of not believing in the gods of the state, corrupting the youth, and making up gods of his own. And so he was ultimately put to death. So it might seem to many on the outside that what's going on is that there's just this annoying dude and he's just kind of problematic for society. So some of what's going on in the background here is, I think, Plato trying to make an account of why we should do philosophy and how it's still defensible, and that and to defend Socrates insofar as to explain why he was the way he was and why also others would react as they did to him. So moving now into the actual story a little bit more. Um, this is the basic setup. So there's people strapped to a wall, and all they can see is various shadows along the wall. There's a light source, and then the shadows are projected onto the wall, and that's all they can ever see. And so they get a picture of the world that consists exclusively of these sort of things. And you could imagine even a continuous sort of puppet session if for some strange reason someone wanted to do this, where it resembles life in a lot of ways, where you go to school, you could even probably a good I guess puppet master could make it seem like you do your commute, and then you go to school and you get lectures, and then you do various other things from day-to-day life. And this would be all these people ever knew. And you might think it to be unpleasant, but I think this is less strange than you might think. Just as a sort of anthropological fact, a lot of people get raised in a lot of strange settings, and a common feature of those lives is that those people will often defend the way that they were raised, even if it has all sorts of things that we might find aberrant or something like that. People, you can find videos on YouTube of people defending their way of life that we take to be oppressive or something like that. So this isn't as crazy as you might think. There's some parallels even in this initial setup. So the other thing to note is that, of course, there's a way out, and this is kind of a narrow tunnel. I don't know if that's meant to be or if this is just some random thing I found on the internet, but it's from a book. So, and then, of course, there's the world that you and I know of that's on the surface. And so the transition will be from being strapped in, seated, to slowly getting out of the tunnel, and then eventually acclimating to the real world and ultimately being able to see the sun, and then going back down and trying to talk to your friends about this world up here and what results. So another sort of case of this, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Clockwork Orange, but a different way of thinking about this is that maybe if this case of the flames doesn't catch your imagination as much, you could think of just a cinema, right? People could be put in front of a very high quality cinematography experience. You might even have like a 3D sort of goggles or something like that that makes it very immersive. So the first really interesting point about all of this is the release. So on one hand, here's a Shawshank Redemption picture I picked out. You might think that someone would be very happy and excited to be released from these sort of terrible conditions. They've spent their whole life strapped to a chair, and they get to see all this exciting new stuff that's much more vivid and interesting than shadows. But Plato doesn't see it that way. Plato suggests, or he states really, that the prisoner that gets released is going to have to be dragged up there, and so it's up to the surface. So it's not clear who the liberator is, but some other person comes and takes this person and forces them to the surface. And it's a little less strange than you might think. As I already sort of suggested, a lot of people are very partial to their way of life, even if we might think that it's not the best way of living. And so we see this probably on a relatively frequent basis, where there's a documented medical phenomena, Stockholm Syndrome, where people begin to really attach to their kidnappers. So rather, the picture is more like something like this. Once again, Shawshank Redemption. I forget the old man's name, but so this old man is institutionalized to the extent that when he's released, he ultimately he tries to make it out in the real world, but he ends up killing himself because he's an institutional man. He can't handle what we think is great opportunity and pleasure and all this liveliness. He just doesn't know how to handle it. So think of the prisoner as something like that. You're so stuck in a single mode of life that you just find it overwhelming to do any other sort of thing. So you have to be kind of forced out there. And I think this is kind of a telling tale about people to a certain extent, and Plato's view of our nature. And this is reinforced elsewhere, but I think Plato generally has a somewhat pessimistic view of most people, insofar as we don't sort of strive for knowledge, right? Like most of us have to try to do homework and that sort of thing. It's time that you dedicate, and otherwise you wouldn't do it if it weren't sort of assigned. How many people read difficult books and that sort of thing on their own? So I think this is a reasonably motivated premise that the person that gets released isn't going to want to go to the surface. And I think it's also telling. So the next thing, there's this gradual process in which, so first shadows, right? So there's first shadows, then shadows on the surface, because we can't look at the light, and then slowly we look at mundane objects. This is probably too small. And then the sun. So this gradual process is sort of the acclimation process, but you also might think about it as a sort of hierarchy of disciplines. So on the first hand, this sort of shadow business is just kind of nonsense, and then shadows on the surface is a little bit closer to the real thing, but it's still just a kind of facsimile, and then the objects themselves are of some interest, but they're not the ultimate source of all being. At the end of the day, the thing in a certain way that motivates or generates everything else is the sun itself. So you might take this as in itself a micro allegory of a sort of hierarchy of disciplines, right? So to a certain extent, maybe a field like biology is interesting because it deals with all these sorts of mundane objects, and I just mean worldly, not like the pejorative sense of mundane. I was going to look up synonyms and see if it's in there. I guess I could. Mundane objects, ordinary, dull, routine, everyday, common objects. And so, I guess it doesn't explicitly say worldly, but this sort of endeavor of maybe a scientist or something like that is only secondary to that of understanding the sun itself, that thing which allows everything else to exist. So, to a certain extent, going back to my defense of philosophy idea, this is a case in which you can see how study of the sun itself, of the fundamental foundation of everything else, and the explanation for why all the other phenomena on Earth exist, takes priority over just all these sorts of individual objects. So you might think of the study of the sun itself as philosophy, and the study of worldly objects as the sort of sciences. Yeah. So another thing that Socrates says, and this is actually not documented by Plato, but Diogenes, I believe. He says there's only one good, knowledge, and one evil, ignorance. And so this is kind of that similar idea, you might say monistic, like singular notion that there is one essential central thing, and that is the good of knowledge. And so this is kind of analogous to the sun. It's the one good. And here is just an ancient Greek image of the sun as a god. Some commentators write this is Apollo on his chariot going across the sky on a daily basis. Some commentators have said that to a certain extent you can think of Plato as a kind of proto-monotheism. It's just kind of like if you remove, the joke is if you remove one of the O's from the good, you have early Christianity. That's probably an oversimplification, but you can see why there's this sort of idea that the fountainhead of everything else is the singular source, and it provides the light and allows everything else to subsist. So it's the sun, it's the good, it's this one singular thing. And that's kind of in contrast to the historical framework in which these ancient Greeks are operating, and that's the, pantheons of gods doing all sorts of things. So you might give some credibility to some of the accusations against Socrates about why people might think he was a little bit heretical. So the next interesting thing is that this person goes down into the cave and looks around and sees his old friends, and there's all sorts of prizes being conferred among the various people that are watching shadows. and then they can see which sequence of shadows occurs, right? So they see, I don't know, you see an oxen, and then you can immediately say, oh, there's a cart coming next, and after the cart there's a man or something like that. And the people amongst themselves, all chained up, give out prizes and say, wow, that guy's really smart for being able to do this. And us, in our position of knowledge, having been to the surface, we say, oh, well, that's kind of a silly activity, right? This is just shadows. This is just fleeting, momentary things that don't have any reality. The real things are the objects that you should be studying, not the shadows. And if we're keeping with this sort of analogy, this has an interesting parallel to modern science. So I'm forgetting this guy's name. He just won the Nobel Prize for biology. In any case, he so this would be an interesting criticism of fields like biology, in which we confer prizes for having done significant accomplishments. But to Plato, this is just kind of playing around with the like passing, momentary little bits of things, when instead we should be worrying about the ultimate source from which all of these things come to be. So, to a certain extent, you kind of agree with the metaphor when you think of like, yeah, if I saw people playing and predicting shadows, I would also kind of think it's silly. But then you apply the analogy to our world, and you think, wow, that's a really strong accusation that, you know, it's kind of childlike and silly to be playing around with shadows, right? That's what Nobel Prize winners do. We think that's a noble thing, not a noble equivocation. We think that's a worthwhile event. So it's a significant indictment. So the thing that's most basic is the sun or the good, right? I'm just going to change this font permanently. And more generally, the forms. So I've already mentioned this briefly before, but Plato has this thing, the theory of the forms, and that's the basic notion that the things that allow for all of the particular individual objects in the world are actually immutable, eternal, unchanging, perfect embodiments of particular things. So if you look in the world and you see all these sorts of different trees that have all sorts of different properties, it's kind of an interesting fact that there's all this different stuff, but it does seem to have something in common. You know, it seems possible that everything could just be a random sort of configuration, and we wouldn't have what seems like are types. We have certain kinds of things that have commonalities. So why is it that, say, all sorts of different species of trees look alike? Well, Plato was the first to really identify this problem, and his explanation was forms. There's one basic sort of archetypal entity that allows for all of this other array of things to exist. And so you can see why this sort of question, so what is the form of the tree, would be a more interesting question than what type of tree that is in particular, right? Because there are innumerable specific types of trees, but there's only one form of the tree. And if you understand this form of the tree, the most basic thing, you understand what's common among all the other trees. So you cannot kind of understand why Plato might think of these sorts of other endeavors as being secondary, as kind of playing with shadows. But I think it's a strong challenge, and I do think it's a legitimate challenge too. If we could understand things in the most general way, why do we spend time researching very specific particular things? You know, there's really bright people out there today doing research on like the mating habits of zebrafinch and that sort of thing. And it seems like, you know, how does that take priority over understanding what it is to exist at all, sort of. So maybe this is something you want to take up and think about in a weekly writing. So the next thing, I've already been talking about this, is the return, right? So there's this interesting thought that once, so the person goes up to the surface and gets acclimated, learns about the sun, realizes that the shadows are all for naught, um, and then returns down to the cave to tell his buddies about it. But then, having entered a dark room from being in the light, this person, the person that went to the surface, is blinded basically. They can't see, and of course they get mocked because, he went up to the surface and he came back without eyes, as one of the passages that Plato writes, um, speaking through one of the cave dwellers. And that seems like kind of a fair indictment. You can hear similar things being said. I guess I've heard this sort of thing talked about people that go to college and then they don't have any sense about them, or this, once again, you can interpret this as a sort of defensive philosophy. And maybe a guy like Socrates, it's like, what is he even talking about? It just seems like he's, talking mumbo jumbo. And the issue is not, at least Plato seems to suggest, the issue is not that Socrates is blind. It's just that Socrates has seen like higher horizons and everyone else is blind. So that's kind of an interesting metaphor there to think about. And another kind of striking feature of this is that Plato says, if anyone tried to free the captives down below, they would get angry. They would go so far as to kill the would-be liberator. And it seems kind of crazy, like, would people really get that upset? And as a historical fact, as I already kind of mentioned, this did happen to Socrates, right? Socrates thought he was onto something, and he wanted to show people at least a method of questioning their beliefs, if not any concrete sort of facts about the world. And it aggravated people so much that they were willing to kill one of the great historical figures. And this still happens today, right? Trying to convince other people of various worldviews, and people get killed all the time. You can use your imagination or think of all sorts of examples. So the ultimate conclusion is then, you cannot put light into blind eyes, and knowledge already exists in the soul. These should have been sort of surprising conclusions considering what we read. This former one isn't so odd. You can kind of see why he would draw that, right? Like, you're not going to be able to convince people of what it's like to be on the outside unless they've been there themselves. They couldn't imagine how splendid it is. But this other one, I'll just explain. This is part of a larger project that Plato seems to have, at least sometimes. This idea that there's knowledge already existent in the soul, and the soul has seen the forms in a past life or in between lives, and that's what explains how we can know things independent of experience, like mathematical truths and stuff. It's because our soul already has the knowledge built into it. So that's where that's coming from, just as a sort of point of reference. So, final thoughts on this. On the whole, I think it's a worthwhile consideration as to think about where Plato may have went wrong or what he's right about, and to see if there's any points at which you could critique this sort of narrative and say that's not how people operate, or maybe provide some additional evidence for, yeah, people do tend to react that way when their beliefs get challenged, or anything to that effect will be of interest. So yeah, I tried the slightly different format, and I hope it was useful. Thanks for your time.